Welcome to the UN Department of Safety and Security's podcast series, Security to Serve Those in Need. In our first episode, connecting security to our beneficiaries, we will be speaking to Gilles Michaud and Ugochi Daniels. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, and thank you for joining our podcast. My name is Ugochi Daniels, and I am the Deputy Director General for Operations at the UN Migration Agency, and very pleased to be here.
As well, I am Gilles Michaud. I'm the Undersecretary General responsible for security in the UN. And I'm so happy, Hugo, that you could join us today to talk about how programming and security link together, and seeking your views, your experience, your opinions on the subject matter.
Amazing. Thank you both for being here and talking to me. So for our first question to kickstart our discussion, what is the nature of the partnership between security and programming, and how are the two interlinked?
From my perspective, I think that the security exists to support program delivery. Like, security does not exist on its own. And from my perspective, when we look at anchoring, well, where does security fit? Really, security fits into ensuring and enabling delivery of programs to those people in need. And this is where it's closely tied together. They work hand in hand. And from my perspective, this is an area that we security, I believe, need to do better at.
I couldn't agree more with Gilles. Certainly from where I sit and my role overseeing operations and IOM, it's a critical partnership. And I'd like to zoom out a bit so that we can recognize why this partnership is so important. And just as Gilles said before me, enabling the role of security in enabling programming and what exactly it is we're trying to achieve here. We have seen, for the past 14 years, global peace continuing to deteriorate. We're seeing growing needs. I mean, just in the last year, almost 100 million people have been forced to flee their homes. We have almost 400 million people in 82 countries facing food insecurity, emergencies. So the needs that the UN, the UN family as a whole are responding to are great, but more and more we are doing them. These needs are in areas that are insecure and growing more insecure. And therefore, the partnership between security and programming is vital to the purpose of the whole UN family.
Thank you both for that answer. So, why is the need right now in 2022 to strengthen the partnership between these two sides of security and programming?
If I may go again first, if you don't mind, I think the work has already started. But Hugo explained a bit of the context in which the UN is asked to operate, the instability that exists, how volatile the environment is as well. And the other part is that I had the opportunity to engage with donors 2 weeks ago, and they were saying quite loudly that expectations are that we will have to do more with less. And this is where, in order to have the biggest impact of the work that the UN and its agencies do, and the impact it's on people, and it's got to be on the beneficiaries. And if we're going to be asked to do more with less, that means that we've got to make sure that partnership between security and between those that are asked to deliver programs is as strong as possible and aligned. And when I say aligned, is making sure that Planning that we do on the security side is aligned to the planning that is done on the programmatic side of our business. But more and more, the environment is more volatile. It's constantly changing, which calls for a stronger partnership between security and the program that it's aimed to support.
And if I can just build on that and add a sense of urgency, certainly for us here at the UN Migration Agency and looking at the impact of climate, what the impact of climate will be, and we see that the countries most vulnerable to the impact of climate at the same time are countries that are extremely fragile and dealing with situations of either crisis or insecurity coupled with poverty. And in such context, we can expect there will be a lot of people on the move for different reasons, some forced to move, some who choose to move. And Gilles had mentioned that there's a lot going on now, but there's going to also be a lot more that will need to be done to respond to these needs, which are going to grow significantly at the time when resources to address the needs are finite, or, as Gilles said, less. So if there ever was a time for an environment that enables our programming to address these needs, it's now. And from what we can see in the future, critically important for the future as well. I had talked a bit about how the global situation with regard to peace had continued to deteriorate over the past 14 years. What we also saw just before COVID, and this was a study done by UNDP, is that 6 out of 7 people in the world feel uncertain about the future. And that was before COVID. So this is a time of great uncertainty for the world. And this is really shaping the context within which we work. So the partnership is critical. It's critical now. It's critical for the future.
Well, I think that what Hugo says is so, again, contextual. It's the reality and this notion that where we're heading, a lot of uncertainty, but again, a lot of, we can expect the unexpected. And I think that we've seen that, and we've seen that recently. Just think about Ukraine, and who last year at this time would have thought that we'd be in this situation in Ukraine. And we've needed to adapt to a new reality. And I think this is something, I'm not saying that there's going to be a war all over the world, but the uncertainty that comes with climate change, the uncertainty that comes with conflict and regional dynamics that are at play, make it as such that it cannot be uncertain in the UN system. The UN system needs to be strong and needs to work as one UN, as we hear. And I think that that's where that we need to invest time and effort and some energy into it.
That does make sense. And I guess you've both already touched on this, but where have you seen this partnership take place? What does it look like? If anybody has any stories and examples of this.
Quite a few stories, but maybe in the interest of time, I can start off with what we have done as IOM in Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. And I visited Nigeria and Afghanistan and have seen this firsthand, where we have set up humanitarian hubs to support the response across the system. So not just IOM's response, but the response for the UN agencies as well as international NGOs and as well. And to set up those hubs, we have worked really, really closely with DSS to do so. And so for instance, in the case of Nigeria, while IOM runs the hubs, DSS runs the security for the hubs on a day-to-day, on an ongoing basis. And we continue in all of the contexts to rely on this very close collaboration with DSS for our day-to-day operations. I mean, I'd like to think we're pretty much joined at the hip, and you really don't see the difference between the programming element and the security element, because it really needs to be integrated when you're in such either a conflict-affected or a fragile context, or responding to a natural disaster that's happening in a conflict-affected area. You don't necessarily see the delineation of the partnership. You see colleagues working really closely together to make sure, I mean, it's a common vested interest for our DSS colleagues that the program delivers and saves lives. So I think from these examples, we can see that on the ground, it's working, would I say, together in unison. So that's a very operational example. And if I also look at an example from when I was the resident coordinator in Iran, the security management team meeting would always take place before the UN country team meeting, so that we could have that security analysis, that we're harnessing the analytical capacity that DSS has to inform the discussions that we're having on the programs. And that is pretty much an ingrained way of working, so that we're piggybacking, we're building on the capacities that DSS brings that are so critical for the programming we're doing now, but also understanding the context more broadly and how best to position our programs in that context.
Yeah, and if I can, and Hugo, you've used a very good example in Iran, and I think from my aspect, that's an approach that needs to exist across the board, where the notion of security is seen as a partner in the country team, and part of the right from the get-go on the planning side of the country team. So to make sure that programmatic discussions are informed by security, and security is informed by programmatic discussions. And I think that is key, and I applaud you and how you've applied this concept in a real-life situation in Iran. And maybe just another example to add to those good ones that Hugo, you spoke about, and I'll speak about Ukraine. And when the war broke out in February, this notion of security partnering with OCHA and partnering with the country team right from the get-go to understand the needs, where the humanitarians wanted to go, and that we could help and assist in how they could get there. And I say this literally, because it was a question of discussions around where hubs were to be situated, and then from that perspective, identifying then what would be required for security to support those hubs, and identifying the resources, not just human, but also assets from a working perspective. So I think that is another example of this partnering from the get-go when it comes to planning in crisis situation, successes that can be garnered from effective partnership.
I see, and this has kind of been touched on in your answers already, but let's more directly discuss one of the most debated topics in security. Do we understand security as an enabler or as a protector?
It's a very good question, and I can speak from a misconception that exists. Because in some instances, yes, in fact, when we talk about security in the UN system, it is about protecting UN personnel, but there are limits to this protection, and really the responsibility to protect UN staff is held by host government. They're the ones that are tasked with, under the UN Charter, to protect UN staff or create a secure environment by which we can operate in. But there are circumstances in which, in very high-risk environments, where this notion of protection needs to exist. This is why we build walls around our compounds. This is why we will deploy senior UN officials and will provide them with close protection officers while they're moving out of these compounds. But that is a very small element of what I would call protection. The key activity, the key responsibility for security in the UN system is to enable, is to ensure that, yes, by providing protection, we are enabling some form of UN activity, but it can always also be seen as being limiting. And when I view the word enabling, it needs to be viewed in a more literal sense of it, where we open the doors, we open opportunities for UN staff to be able to safely and securely go about doing their business day in and day out. So yeah, there's this tension that exists always between these two words and these responsibilities. But I think that we're in an environment where we need to make it work.
Well, there's not too much to add to what Gilles has said, because I totally agree that in this context, protection is part of enabling. And what we're seeing in many of the contexts where we work is that the hardest to reach areas and the most the areas that are most in need are often the hardest to reach, and ensuring access has a huge security component to it. And so that enabling role on how we can operate and save lives in the hardest to reach and the least accessible to those most in need is critically important. And for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, is going to become more and more the reality of our work. And therefore, the enabling role of protection and not seeing them as different and dealing with that tension and making sure it works, because if it doesn't work, the cost of that is lives of people. So working in unison and addressing that tension, critically important. But I think the fundamental thing is the common understanding that enabling and protection are pretty much two sides of the same coin.
Completely agree. So following on from that, where do we start to strengthen the link between security and programs, and how do we take a more beneficiaries-focused approach?
I think that's the key question. And I think that, and I'll bring it back, Aina, to this notion of we're in the UN or in the UN system for the greater good of humanity. And humanity is about people and helping people. And it doesn't matter if it's about peace, if it's about development, if it's about humanitarian assistance. At the end of the day, they are beneficiaries to our services. And I truly believe that for us, the number one accountability is to them, is to the beneficiaries, and making sure that services that are provided by the UN reaches them. And this is where, back to what Hugo was saying around this notion of protection and enabling, two sides of the same coin, is that at the end of the day, whenever we're looking at were we successful in implementing security measures, and I think that it needs to be gauged by the people that we serve. Some may say that the people we serve are UN staff when we talk about security. But I will tell you that it's beyond that. Yes, it's for security of UN staff, but our main accountability is to make sure that did we reach those people in need? And that is where the accountability lies.
I think, of course, fully agree with the very important point that Gilles raises, where the accountability lies, and that's in the lives of the people. Or not in the lives, accountability to the people. And something I think that's critically important is the mindset shift with regard to collective ownership of the outcomes that impact the lives of people. So for all of us in the UN family, regardless from which mandate or which area that we work in, we're all working towards a collective outcome together and owning that together. So it's also the accountability, first and foremost, the accountability to the people, but it's also the accountability to each of us in our roles, in playing our role to that common outcome that we have across the board, regardless of what our mandate is.
And what is security doing today to strengthen this partnership?
That is probably one of the most important questions here, at least for the workforce in the department, because it's on us now. It's on us to ensure that we strengthen those partnerships. But what are we doing is that, and back to what Hugo said in respect to this collective and common outcome. And it's understanding what those outcomes are. And from that perspective is that we are providing a tool for security professionals out in the field to be able to identify those outcomes, identify the activities, and through that process, then identify which partnerships are key to the successful outcomes in country. And this is what we're going to be talking about over the course of a full week in Terrytown in a couple of weeks from now, as to what this tool is all about, how to apply it, what it means for the leadership team in the department, and the support that they will receive from headquarters in navigating this new approach to doing our business. But that is key to our success moving forward.
I think all I can add as a former resident coordinator, that's music, will be music to the ears of RCs, HCs. But also in my current role, and I had already talked about how strong the partnership was, but the plan that Gilles has outlined for DSS, I think is critically important for the UN as a system, not just the partnership on security and programming, but how the system comes together and owns the outcomes that have impact on people's lives and deliver on our commitment and accountability to them.
Well, good, and I'm glad to hear that. I think that, but it comes from the consultations that we've had over the course of the last year or so with the RCs, like you say, with some of the heads of missions, some of my colleagues in the agencies, funds, and programs around what they need from us, and hopefully these tools that we're deploying will get us to where we need to be. I'm convinced I have the workforce to make it happen. I think that I've got individuals that are committed for the greater good of humanity, but it's a question of changing a bit of the mindset and giving them the support that they need.
You motivated me immensely, Gilles, so it was great.
You're being too kind.
No, but it's true. I mean, what you're doing as DSS is really what the system needs. All of us need to be owning what it is we say we are committing to. It's spot on.
Thank you both so much for participating. It was great to talk to you.
So Aina, thank you so much for facilitating all of this.
Thank you too.